My brother mocked my business for years. Now he tells investors he's the co-founder. My brother Keith spent 5 years laughing at my custom furniture business, while I worked 18-hour days in my garage building tables and chairs that he called amateur garbage made by someone who couldn't get a real job. He'd bring his friends over to point at my workshop and joke about his sister playing carpenter pretending she had talent. He'd tell our parents I was wasting my life on a hobby that would never pay bills while he made 6 figures at his corporate consulting job, where he basically made PowerPoints all day. He'd post photos of my early pieces on his social media with crying laugh emojis saying, "This is what happens when people watch too many DIY videos." He'd come to craft fairs where I sold pieces and loudly tell customers they could get better stuff at discount stores for half the price. He actually scared away buyers by saying my joints would fall apart and the wood was probably infested with termites even though I used kiln-dried hardwood and traditional joinery that would last generations. When I got my first real commission for a dining set, Keith told the client I was unreliable and they should hire professionals instead. The client almost canceled until they saw my portfolio. When I rented a proper workshop space, Keith told everyone I was throwing away money on a failing venture and predicted I'd be bankrupt in 6 months. When I hired my first employee, Keith said I was exploiting desperate people who couldn't find real jobs. When I got featured in a local magazine, Keith said they only wrote about me because they needed to fill space and promote women in trades even if they weren't qualified. He'd show up at my workshop uninvited with potential clients he'd mysteriously run into and tell them about all my failures and mistakes while I was trying to close deals. He'd mention pieces that took me longer than estimated, or clients who'd requested minor adjustments like these were massive failures instead of normal business operations. For 3 years straight, Keith gave me the same birthday gift, which was a book about finding stable careers and a job application for his company. He'd make speeches at family dinners about how some people were meant to be employees, not entrepreneurs, and there was no shame in admitting failure. He'd pull me aside at every holiday and offer to get me an interview at his firm where I could be a receptionist or data entry clerk, which he said was more my speed. Everything changed when that tech company ordered 50 pieces for their new headquarters. They paid $300,000 up front and wanted everything custom designed. Suddenly, Keith started showing up at my workshop daily, asking about the business model and profit margins. He offered to help with paperwork and suggested we should formalize our partnership. I asked what partnership, and he said obviously he'd been supporting me from the beginning as a silent partner, providing moral support and business guidance. He actually said his mockery had been reverse psychology to motivate me, and I should be grateful for his unique mentorship style. He started telling people we'd built the business together with his strategy and my labor. He updated his LinkedIn to say he was co-founder and creative director of my company. He printed business cards with his name and my company logo. He scheduled meetings with my clients, introducing himself as the business development executive. He told investors at his country club that we were looking for expansion capital, and he was handling negotiations as the financial brain of the operation. One investor actually called me confused about why Keith was promising 40% returns when I'd never discussed investment at all. Keith had created a pitch deck full of fake numbers and projections claiming we'd be a $100 million company in 5 years. That's when I discovered Keith had registered an LLC with a name almost identical to mine, but with him as sole proprietor. He was trying to redirect contracts to his company and steal my clients. He'd already invoiced 2 customers using his LLC and deposited their payments in his account. He'd hired a lawyer to send me papers offering to buy my workshop and equipment for $10,000, which he called generous, considering I'd soon be competing against him and would lose. He said I should accept his offer and work for him as shop foreman while he handled the business side, since clearly I was only good at manual labor, not management. I knew Keith's weakness was his ego and his corporate job where image mattered more than anything. So I invited his boss Harrison to tour my workshop for a custom desk commission. While Harrison was there, I casually mentioned how proud Keith must be of his baby sister's success, after all those years of telling everyone I'd fail. Harrison looked confused and said Keith had told them he was the mastermind behind the business. I showed Harrison my registration documents from 5 years ago, before Keith even knew I was starting a company. I showed him the magazine article where Keith wasn't mentioned because he'd had nothing to do with anything. Then I showed Harrison the LLC documents Keith had filed using his company computer during work hours, which was against corporate policy. I showed him the fraudulent invoices Keith had created. Harrison was furious that Keith had been running a side business on company time using company resources. Keith got fired the next day. The phone started ringing at 7:30 the next morning. I was still in my workshop reviewing the tech company contract when the first call came through from a number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard a man's voice asking if this was the furniture business that had sent him an invoice last week. My stomach dropped because I knew exactly what this was about. I explained that I hadn't sent any invoices recently and asked him to describe what he'd received. He said someone named Keith had invoiced him for a custom bookshelf project, and he'd already paid $5,000 to an account that looked legitimate. I told him Keith had no authority to invoice anyone, and that he'd stolen my business information to create fake documents. The client went quiet for a long moment before apologizing and saying he should have verified everything directly with me. I offered to honor the original quote we discussed months ago and build the bookshelf myself for the same price he'd already paid Keith. He agreed immediately and thanked me for being professional about the whole mess. The second call came 20 minutes later from a woman who'd paid Keith $3,000 for dining chairs that were supposedly ready for pickup. I went through the same explanation and made the same offer, and she also agreed to work with me directly, instead of demanding refunds or threatening legal action. My phone buzzed with a text message while I was still on the second call. Then another text. Then 3 more in rapid succession. I glanced at the screen and saw Keith's name with a wall of messages filling my notifications. The first message said I'd ruined his entire life over a stupid misunderstanding. The second said I was a vindictive person who couldn't handle family success. The third begged me to call him so we could work this out like adults. The fourth accused me of sabotaging him on purpose because I'd always been jealous of his corporate career. The fifth said siblings were supposed to support each other through hard times. I took screenshots of every message as they kept coming in, watching the count climb past 20 within an hour. Some messages were angry and blamed me for getting him fired. Others were desperate and pleaded with me to fix things with his former boss. A few tried to rewrite history by claiming he'd always believed in my business and just wanted to help me succeed. I saved everything to a folder on my phone and then searched online for business attorneys in my area. I called 3 offices before finding one that could meet with me that same afternoon. The attorney's name was Colby Jefferson, and his assistant said he specialized in business fraud cases. I drove to his office at 2 o'clock with printed copies of Keith's fake LLC documents, the fraudulent invoices and screenshots of his text messages. Colby reviewed everything while I explained the 5 years of mockery followed by Keith's sudden attempt to steal my clients and claim co-founder status. He asked specific questions about timing and documentation, then told me the evidence was clear enough to file immediate legal action. He said I should block Keith's number and let all future communication go through legal channels, because anything Keith said now could be used against him in court. I blocked Keith's number in the parking lot before driving back to my workshop. Colby called me 2 days later to say he'd filed paperwork to dissolve Keith's fraudulent LLC and recover the stolen client payments. He'd also requested a restraining order preventing Keith from contacting my clients or using any version of my business name. The court had fast-tracked the case because Keith's fraud was still actively happening and more clients could be affected if we didn't stop him quickly. Colby explained that the evidence made this an unusually straightforward case since Keith had created paper trails for everything he'd done wrong. The LLC registration showed he'd filed during work hours using his company computer. The fake invoices had my company logo, but his bank account information. The LinkedIn updates and business cards proved he was deliberately misrepresenting himself as my business partner. Colby said we'd probably have a hearing within 2 weeks instead of the usual month-long wait. My mom called that evening while I was finishing a table assembly. She said my dad wanted to talk to me about Keith and asked if I could come over for dinner. I said I was busy with work, but I could talk on the phone right now. She sighed and said Keith had told them I'd gotten him fired, and now I was suing him over a family disagreement. I asked her what Keith had said exactly, and she repeated his version where he'd been trying to help me with business development, and I'd overreacted by involving his boss. I told her Keith had stolen $8,000 from my clients by creating fake invoices and depositing payments into his own account. She went quiet. I said Keith had also registered a fake company using my business name and tried to redirect my contracts to himself. More silence. I explained that this wasn't about hurt feelings or family drama, but actual crimes that could have destroyed the business I'd spent 5 years building. My mom finally said that Keith had already lost his job, and maybe that was punishment enough without lawyers getting involved. I told her Keith had committed fraud and theft, and losing his job was a consequence of his own choices, not something I'd done to him. My dad got on the phone and said I was being stubborn and unforgiving. I said I was protecting my business and my clients from someone who'd proven he couldn't be trusted. He said Keith was still my brother and family should stick together through hard times. I said Keith had spent 5 years mocking my work and then tried to steal everything the moment I became successful. My mom took the phone back and suggested we all needed some space to cool down before we said things we'd regret. I agreed and hung up. Heather showed up early the next morning and asked to talk privately before we started work. She'd heard rumors at a craft fair that Keith had been redirecting contracts and wanted to know if the company was in danger. I realized I couldn't keep this situation quiet if it was already affecting my business reputation. I showed her all the legal documents Colby had filed and explained everything Keith had done from the fake LLC to the stolen client payments. Heather's face went red and she said she'd testify in court if it would help my case. She reminded me about the craft fair 2 years ago, when Keith had shown up and loudly told customers my joints were poorly made. She said another vendor had pulled her aside afterward and warned her that working for me might be risky if my own brother was bad-mouthing the quality. Heather had ignored the warning because she could see my craftsmanship was solid, but now she understood Keith had been actively sabotaging my reputation for years. She asked what she could do to help, and I told her the best thing was to keep building quality furniture and maintaining our client relationships. The business itself was fine, and the legal case would handle Keith's fraud. The bank called that afternoon with an update on their fraud investigation. The manager said they'd frozen Keith's business account and recovered the $5,000 payment from the first client I'd talked to. The second client had paid in cash directly to Keith so that money was harder to trace, but they were working with law enforcement to document the theft. I called Malik, my accountant, and asked him to help me calculate the exact financial damage for the legal case. He came to the workshop that evening with his laptop, and we went through every invoice, every client interaction, and every cost related to Keith's interference. The stolen payments totaled $8,000. The time I'd spent dealing with confused clients and fixing Keith's mess added another $2,000 in lost productivity. The legal fees were already at $6,000 and climbing. The potential damage to my business reputation from Keith's fake LLC was harder to quantify, but Malik estimated at least $2,000 in future client losses. The total came to around $18,000 in direct damages, plus whatever the court decided about the reputation harm. Keith showed up at my workshop 3 days later without any warning. I was sanding a chair leg when I heard someone open the front door and turned to see him walking toward me. He held up both hands and said he just wanted to talk. I kept the sander running and asked what he thought he was doing here after Colby had sent him a warning letter. Keith said the letter was exactly why he needed to talk to me before this got out of hand. He offered to pay back half the money if I'd drop the legal case and tell our parents it was all a misunderstanding. I turned off the sander and pulled out my phone. I dialed the police non-emergency line while Keith was still standing there telling me I was being unreasonable. The dispatcher answered, and I explained that someone was at my business location despite being warned to stay away through legal counsel. Keith's expression changed, and he backed toward the door saying this wasn't over. He left before the police arrived, but I stayed on the line and filed a report documenting that he'd violated the no-contact instruction. The officer who showed up 20 minutes later took my statement and gave me a case number to provide to Colby. Austin from the tech company sent an email the next morning with the subject line asking about ownership structure. My chest tightened when I saw it because I knew Keith must have contacted them. The email said someone claiming to be my business partner had reached out to their procurement department, asking about payment schedules and future orders. Austin wanted to know if there were any ownership disputes he should be aware of before they continued with the contract. I forwarded Keith's fraudulent pitch deck and wrote a professional explanation of the situation. I attached copies of my business registration from 5 years ago, and the legal documents showing Keith had no ownership stake and had created a fake company to steal clients. I explained that I'd taken legal action to stop the fraud and protect my clients. Austin responded within an hour, saying he appreciated the transparency and confirming that their contract was solely with my registered company. He said their legal team had already blocked Keith's contact information and flagged his fake LLC in their vendor system. Colby called me that afternoon saying Keith's lawyer had reached out trying to negotiate a settlement. Keith wanted to pay back the stolen money over time in exchange for me signing a non-disparagement agreement that would prevent me from telling anyone what he'd done. I said no before Colby even finished explaining the offer. I told him Keith didn't get to steal from me and then control whether I could tell the truth about his crimes. Colby said he'd expected that answer and had already told Keith's lawyer we weren't interested in any settlement that included silence clauses. He said we'd proceed with the full legal case and let the court decide appropriate consequences. My mom called on Saturday morning inviting both me and Keith to Sunday dinner so we could talk things out as a family. I said I wouldn't be in the same room as Keith until the legal case was resolved. She said I was being stubborn and that family dinners shouldn't be affected by business disagreements. I told her this wasn't a disagreement but a criminal case involving fraud and theft. My dad took the phone and said I was being unforgiving and holding grudges. He started comparing this to childhood fights over toys and saying siblings always worked things out eventually. I hung up when he said I needed to be the bigger person and forgive Keith for making a mistake. The phone rang again immediately, but I let it go to voicemail. My dad's message said I was tearing the family apart over money and that I'd regret this someday when Keith wasn't around anymore. I deleted the message and went back to work on the tech company order. 2 days after my dad's voicemail, I got an email from someone named Courtney Beck with a subject line that said, "Information about Keith Cisneros." I almost deleted it thinking it was spam until I saw she worked at Keith's old company. She wrote that she'd been Harrison's assistant for 3 years and had watched Keith treat support staff like they were invisible or stupid. She said she had copies of emails where Keith used company resources for personal projects and claimed he was in client meetings when he was actually at lunch or running errands. She offered to provide statements if it would help my legal case because she was tired of people like Keith getting away with bad behavior. I forwarded everything to Colby, who said this was exactly the kind of evidence that would strengthen our restraining order petition. He said having a third-party witness to Keith's pattern of dishonesty and rule-breaking would show the judge this wasn't just a family argument, but a pattern of fraudulent behavior. The court date arrived 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning at 9. I wore business clothes and brought a folder with all my documentation organized by date. Keith showed up 10 minutes late with a lawyer in an expensive suit who immediately started talking about how family disputes should be handled privately. The judge was a woman in her 50s who looked annoyed before anyone even started speaking. Colby presented the evidence of Keith's fake LLC, the stolen client payments, the fraudulent invoices, and the documentation of Keith showing up at my workshop after being warned not to. He showed the text messages where Keith alternated between threats and fake apologies. He showed Courtney's statement about Keith's history of dishonesty at work. Keith's lawyer tried to argue that siblings have disagreements, and legal intervention was excessive. The judge cut him off and said fraud isn't a disagreement, and theft isn't a family matter. She granted a 1-year restraining order that prohibited Keith from contacting me, coming to my workshop, or contacting any of my clients. She ordered him to pay full restitution for the stolen funds, plus my legal costs, which totaled about $22,000. Keith's face went red and he started to say something, but his lawyer grabbed his arm. The judge said if Keith violated the order, he'd face criminal charges. We walked out and Keith was standing in the hallway glaring at me, but he didn't say anything. That afternoon, Keith started posting on social media about betrayal and how family should support each other through hard times. He didn't mention my name, but it was obvious he was talking about me. He posted things about how success changes people and how some family members forget where they came from. Within hours, I had 5 different people texting or calling asking what happened between me and Keith. I didn't respond to the social media posts, but when people asked me directly, I told them the basic facts without drama. Keith tried to steal my business by creating a fake company and taking client payments. I took legal action to stop him. Most people were shocked and said they had no idea. A few mutual friends from high school stopped following both of us, which I figured meant they didn't want to pick sides. My insurance agent Nina called the next week saying she'd heard through business connections about what happened with Keith. She asked if I wanted to review my coverage, and I said yes because I hadn't even thought about protecting against this kind of fraud. We met at her office and she walked me through adding specific coverage for identity theft and fraudulent business claims. She said this kind of family business fraud happens more often than people realize because family members have access to information and people don't expect their relatives to steal from them. She said having proper documentation like I did and business insurance made a huge difference in recovery. The new coverage cost me an extra $200 a year, but it felt worth it to know I had protection if anyone tried this again. 3 weeks after Keith got fired, Colby called saying Keith's lawyer had reached out with a message. Keith couldn't make the full restitution payment because he was unemployed and struggling financially. His lawyer asked if we'd accept a reduced settlement. Colby asked what I wanted to do, and I said no reduced settlement. I told him Keith should have thought about financial consequences before he committed fraud. Colby said that's what he figured I'd say. He told Keith's lawyer we'd accept a payment plan, but only if the full amount was legally guaranteed with interest included. The payment plan would be $200 a month until the full amount plus interest was paid. Keith's lawyer agreed because they didn't have much choice with the court order in place. I finished the tech company order 2 days ahead of schedule. All 50 pieces were delivered and installed in their new headquarters on a Friday morning. Austin walked through inspecting everything and kept stopping to run his hands over the wood and test the joints. He said the quality exceeded his expectations and asked if I was available for future projects. He mentioned they were opening 2 more offices in the next year and would need furniture for both. He also said he'd already referred me to 2 other companies in their building who were looking for custom work. I thanked him and said I'd send proposals for the future projects. Driving back to my workshop, I felt like this was proof that my business had always been real, and Keith's attempts to claim credit or destroy my reputation hadn't mattered. The work spoke for itself. My mom called that Sunday afternoon crying so hard I could barely understand her. She said Keith had to move back home because he couldn't afford his apartment anymore. She begged me to consider that he was my brother and he was suffering enough. I told her Keith created his own consequences through fraud and theft. I said I wasn't responsible for fixing problems he caused himself. She said I was being cold and holding grudges. She said Keith made a mistake, but he was family, and family forgives. I told her Keith didn't make a mistake. He committed crimes over several months while knowing exactly what he was doing. She hung up on me. My dad called 10 minutes later and left a voicemail saying I was tearing the family apart, and I needed to be the bigger person. I didn't call back. Heather brought up an idea the following Tuesday while we were working on a custom bookshelf order. She said we should formalize the business structure so nobody could ever claim partnership or co-founder status again. I realized she was right that Keith had exposed a weakness in how I'd set things up. We scheduled a meeting with Colby to create proper legal entities and operating agreements. He helped us file everything correctly with clear ownership documentation that listed me as sole proprietor and Heather as employee with defined responsibilities. It cost me $1,500 in legal fees, but it felt like closing a door that Keith had tried to walk through. 6 months passed and Keith had paid back about half the restitution through his monthly payments. He was working 2 retail jobs according to my mom, who kept trying to guilt me into forgiving him. My parents invited me to family dinners and holiday gatherings, but always mentioned that Keith would be there too. I stopped going to most events because I wasn't ready to be in the same room as him. My mom called every few weeks asking when I'd forgive him and let things go back to normal. I told her things would never go back to normal because Keith had never actually apologized or said he understood why what he did was wrong. She said I was holding grudges and being stubborn. I said I was maintaining boundaries with someone who committed fraud against me. We'd have the same conversation and then not talk for a few weeks. The business kept growing with 3 new major contracts coming in from referrals. I was working 10-hour days and Heather was maxed out on hours. I started looking at hiring a second employee because we had enough steady work to support another salary. Every new contract and every satisfied client felt like proof that I'd been right to protect what I built. Keith had tried to steal my success and claim credit for work he'd mocked for years. Taking legal action meant ongoing tension with my parents and awkward family gatherings where I wasn't welcome. But watching my business grow and knowing it was protected felt worth that cost, even when my mom called crying about family being torn apart. 2 weeks later, Colby called to say Keith's lawyer had sent over a formal apology letter as part of the restitution agreement. I drove to Colby's office to read it in person, because I didn't want that document sitting in my email where I might see it accidentally. The letter was 3 pages long on fancy letterhead with Keith's signature at the bottom. I read through it twice while sitting in Colby's conference room with the door closed. The first paragraph said Keith regretted the misunderstanding between us and acknowledged that his actions had caused financial and emotional harm to my business. The second and third paragraphs talked about how losing his job had created unexpected hardship, and how the monthly restitution payments were straining his limited budget from retail work. The fourth paragraph mentioned our family relationship, and expressed hope that we could eventually move past this difficult period. The final paragraph said he took full responsibility for his mistakes, and hoped I would accept his sincere apology. I set the letter down on the table and looked at Colby. He asked if I wanted to respond, and I said no. The whole thing read like something his lawyer had written with maybe 5 minutes of input from Keith about his money problems. There was nothing about the 5 years of mockery or the craft fairs where he scared away customers or the birthday gifts telling me to get a real job. Nothing about how he'd tried to steal my clients and redirect contracts to his fake company. Just vague language about mistakes and misunderstandings like he'd accidentally used the wrong invoice template instead of committing deliberate fraud. I told Colby to acknowledge receipt through official channels, but I wouldn't be writing back personally. Keith could have his lawyer-drafted apology on file for the court records, but I wasn't going to pretend it meant anything real. Thanksgiving arrived, and my mom called 3 times in 2 days to confirm I was coming to dinner. She'd worked out a schedule where I would come at 2 and leave by 5, then Keith would arrive at 6 for the evening portion. I agreed because I wanted to see my parents even though the whole arrangement felt ridiculous. I drove to their house with a store-bought pie because I hadn't had time to bake anything. My mom hugged me at the door and immediately started talking about how nice it was to have family together for the holidays. My dad was watching football in the living room and barely looked up when I said hello. We sat down to eat at 2:30 with just the 3 of us at the table. My mom asked about the business and I told her about the new contracts and the bookshelf orders that were keeping us busy through December. My dad cut into his turkey and said it was good I was staying busy. Then he added that family should always come first, no matter how successful a business got. I kept eating and didn't respond. My mom tried to change the subject by talking about my aunt's new job, but my dad kept going. He said siblings fought sometimes, but blood was thicker than water, and business disputes shouldn't tear families apart. I put down my fork and said this wasn't a business dispute. Keith had stolen money from my clients and tried to destroy the company I spent 5 years building. My dad said everyone made mistakes, and Keith had lost his job, which was punishment enough. I said Keith had committed actual crimes, including fraud and identity theft. My mom's eyes filled with tears, and she asked why I couldn't just forgive him and move on. I realized sitting there with my half-eaten plate that they would never understand. To them, this was just a fight between siblings who needed to get over it. They couldn't see that Keith hadn't hurt my feelings or insulted me. He'd committed crimes that could have destroyed everything I worked for and stolen from innocent clients who trusted me. I finished eating quickly and left at 4 instead of 5. My mom followed me to the door asking me to stay longer, but I said I had work to do. I drove home and spent the rest of Thanksgiving evening in my workshop sanding table legs, while my family had their evening dinner shift with Keith. The next 11 months passed with steady monthly restitution payments and zero contact with Keith. The business grew with 2 employees now and enough contracts to fill our schedule through the following spring. I hired a second woodworker in March after Austin referred me to another tech company that wanted custom conference tables. Heather trained the new guy on our finishing techniques and quality standards. My parents kept inviting me to family events with the same schedule system where Keith and I never overlapped. I went to a few, but mostly I was too busy with work. Extended family members would ask careful questions about how things were going, and I'd give short answers about the business doing well. Nobody mentioned Keith directly, but everyone knew what had happened, because my mom had probably told the whole family her version where I was being stubborn and unforgiving. 1 year after Keith got fired, Colby called to say the final restitution payment had cleared, and the legal case was officially closed. All the stolen money had been paid back with interest. The restraining order had expired months earlier. The court records were filed and done. I thanked Colby for handling everything and paid his final invoice that same day. The business was thriving with a client base built on referrals and reputation. I had 2 skilled employees who showed up on time and did excellent work. We were booked solid through summer with enough profit that I was finally paying myself a real salary instead of just covering expenses. But I hadn't been to a family dinner in 4 months and my dad had stopped calling. My mom still reached out, but the conversations were short and awkward. Keith's name never came up, but he was there in every silence and careful topic change. Extended family gatherings felt tense with people avoiding certain subjects, and my aunt changing conversation topics whenever someone mentioned business success. I'd built everything I wanted professionally, but the cost was accepting that my parents would always take Keith's side, and the family would always see me as the one who couldn't forgive and move on. I signed a lease on a bigger workshop space in October with room for a showroom area in the front. The new location had better parking and visibility from the main road. I spent 2 weeks moving equipment and setting up display pieces that showed the range of custom work we could do. Heather helped me arrange the showroom with our best examples, including the dining table that had won a local craftsmanship award. I hired a part-time person to handle showroom hours and customer consultations while we worked in the back. The expansion felt like proof that protecting my business had been the right choice, even when it cost me family relationships. Keith had tried to steal my success by claiming he was the co-founder and redirecting clients to his fake company. He'd spent 5 years mocking my work, and then tried to take credit the moment it became profitable. His plan had failed because I'd been willing to take legal action and show his boss exactly what he'd done. But that choice meant living with parents who thought I should have just forgiven him, and family members who avoided talking about my business because it reminded everyone of the conflict. I stood in the new showroom on opening day looking at the custom pieces on display and the workshop visible through the back windows. This was mine. I'd built it from nothing in a garage while Keith laughed and told everyone I'd fail. I'd protected it when he tried to steal it. The business kept growing with new contracts and satisfied clients. Keith's attempt to destroy what I built had ultimately failed. The cost was a fractured family and parents who would probably never understand why I couldn't just let it go. That was the reality I'd learned to live with while my business continued growing, and my workshop kept producing furniture that clients loved enough to refer their friends.